Battle of Hastings in 1066 was a turning point in the history of Europe. The Bayeux Tapestry shows William of Normandy defeating King Harold of England. Two different leaders, two very different styles of fighting.
This creature is for one purpose only, dealing death.
Historians have always said that William won because he was a better general. But was his victory inevitable? No clues have ever been found on the battlefield. So researchers are now using a surprising array of unusual specialist techniques to investigate what really happened.
What we really need to do is to peel back the layers from the modern world and get back to the landscape of 1066.
Using their new findings, experts are piecing together the real story of 1066. Was William's victory at Hastings down to military skill, or just good luck? In the 11th century, Northern Europe was a place of raids and conquest, changes of dynasty and instability. Vikings, Anglo-Saxons and Normans were among those who fought to dominate the lands of the north. In 1066, attention focused on England. On October the 14th, 1066, Harold, King of England, went into battle against William, Duke of Normandy. On this hill near Hastings, on the south coast of England, a modern Norman army of knights on horseback defeated a traditional Anglo-Saxon army of foot soldiers protected only by shields. Thousands died in one of the longest battles in medieval history. And at the end of the day, William was the new King of England.
Harold, you've probably heard of him. He's the guy that got the arrow in the eye. He was a good soldier.
The detective work begins in the world of modern business.
And the chairman was a frightfully nice chap.
Can management theory shed new light on whether William was the better general?
What we're going to do is make some analogies between modern business with mergers, acquisitions, takeovers, and what happened 1,000 years ago with the hostile takeover of a company called England.
Stephen Carver teaches project management at one of Europe's leading business schools.
First of all, Harold. 6'2" tall, mustachioed, dashing, women loved him. He'd been deputy head of England under his father. The positive side of that was that he was actually respected by his staff. He'd been a line manager, he'd worked his way up. Now, William, a completely, totally different guy. You'll notice the finger here on the Bayeux Tapestry. Yes, this guy liked using his finger. I have a plan, I am right, you are wrong, we are going to do it my way. He was unstoppable. He always had a plan, and he had a plan to back up the plan, to back up the plan in case the plan went wrong. So, his official court title was William the Bastard. Now, can you imagine as a child being referred to officially as William the Bastard? You know, William the Bastard, come over here. The guy was balanced, he had chips on both shoulders.
In the business world, it's important to know your competitor's history. William and Harold had actually met 2 years earlier. Harold had been shipwrecked off the northern French coast, and William had rescued him.
Rescue in inverted commas. It was pretty obvious that Harold basically had no way out. He wasn't going to leave Normandy alive unless he gave William what he wanted. And really, William was doing this to find out what made Harold tick. What sort of soldier was he?
When Edward the Confessor died and Harold took the crown, William prepared to invade England. Harold called up an army to confront him. By July, Harold's army occupied the south coast of England, and William had assembled his fleet in Normandy. A good general proves himself not only in battle, but also in the months beforehand. Preparation is vitally important.
You can look back to the logistic commander and see if his logistics supported his mission properly. Often, poor logistics is one of the crucial reasons why an operation doesn't succeed.
Colonel Paul Budd plans British Army campaigns today. He deals with the same basic problems as they would have done in 1066. Can he tell whether William was better prepared for the battle?
We're looking for about 2,500 calories a man day. So if we input some of the ingredients here, for example, the barley, oats, leeks seems to have been a commonly available ingredient, onions.
A major part of successful logistics is being able to supply food. So who managed better, Harold or William?
As William was going to invade across the Channel, he would have had to have taken a far more centralist view of his logistic planning.
This is exactly what William did. He paid for everything himself and fed his men from a central base. In contrast, Harold's army, known as the Third, was a kind of national service where each soldier brought 2 months' supply of food with him.
Harold relied on his Third coming in, probably supporting themselves in small village groups, and therefore he would have been able to have a far more flexible logistic organisation and be able to respond and change his forces probably more easily.
Harold actually had a better way of keeping his army going. However, the time of year was crucial. In the medieval world, July was the month when food was most scarce. And this was precisely the moment William chose to get his fleet together. Did clever timing give William the edge?
For Harold, during August, there would have been a great deal of psychological pressure on his soldiers to want to return home and join in the harvest. From William's perspective, September was the optimum time to attack England, and for him there was the greatest chance of being able to pillage local supplies and replenish his own larders.
By September the 8th, the Anglo-Saxons had used up all their food, and Harold had to disband his army. It looked like William had proved the better planner, as just 4 days later, with Harold at his most vulnerable, William set sail for England. Most of what we know about the events of 1066 comes from a medieval strip cartoon. Although it's called the Bayeux Tapestry, it is in fact an embroidery. But can we rely on this ancient wall hanging as historical evidence?
Here is a lovely little touch. 2 female centaurs with flowing blonde hair and welcoming arms. Centaurs were well known as symbols of lust, and this is the hunt here, where 2 men are running with clubs, but also this chap's showing his genitals here, quite clearly. So that is another little rude remark about King William's laws on hunting. I've studied it quite clearly under a microscope, in fact, and it's clearly his bits and pieces all hanging down.
Jan Messent has spent years working out how the tapestry was made. She knows the secret of why it can be taken seriously as evidence. It's not just that it was made within 4 years of the battle. It's also the fact of who made it.
This is exactly the kind of woman who would have been embroidering this actual scene. They were noble women. Their husbands had been fighting and killed on the battlefield at Hastings. It sounds rather strange that Anglo-Saxon women would be making a Norman hanging for perhaps a Norman man, giving a Norman version of the events. I don't think that they would have seen it as anything but a fair representation of how brave their own menfolk were and how well they fought.
Jan has also discovered when the tapestry's evidence should not be taken literally.
When you begin to take the tapestry apart, and there are 7 joins in it, then you begin to realise that each of the 8 sections were done in a different venue. The woman who embroidered this yellow horse began to embroider over the join without realising that the next horse to her is also yellow. So it's got yellow chest and legs, and the rest of it is brown. That simply happened because there was a join and because she hadn't seen what was actually happening on the next piece.
So the tapestry's evidence can only be relied on in parts. Some of its details are accurate, others are mistakes. And sometimes bits of information are simply left out. The scene of William's preparations, followed by his ships crossing the channel, is a perfect example. It looks like after months of planning, William had waited for just the right moment to pounce. But had he?
The Arda Sun, Dover Coast Guard. Good afternoon, sir.
Medieval scholars Gerald and Christine Grange have scoured one of the earliest written accounts of the campaign, known as the Carmen of Hastings.
Call and your destination, over.
They have compared its descriptions of weather to wind patterns in the Channel today. Their research is making clear just how much control over his campaign William really had.
In 1066, William clearly was still at the mercy of the winds. Honestly, one can say that even a modern yachtsman would reckon to be at the mercy of the winds. The Normans would be using Viking-type double-ended ships with a single square sail for their invasion crossing. You'd be looking ideally for a southerly wind.
Wind patterns in the Channel have been consistent for thousands of years. Throughout August, William had been waiting to cross with nearly 700 ships. He couldn't leave without a southerly wind.
The weather in the English Channel is dominated by the Atlantic low. These are low-pressure systems which follow each other in sequence from the Atlantic across northwest Europe. The winds associated with an Atlantic low are quite characteristic. They go in an anti-clockwise direction around the centre. The significance of that for William is that he could set sail with a southwest, but would run the danger that that would be followed by a westerly and then a northwesterly, which would effectively prevent him from reaching England.
Reading the Carmen, William's problem becomes clear. 1066 was an unusually bad summer.
The Carmen of Hastings records that if suddenly the north wind diverted and held off the south, lamenting, you bedewed your face with welling tears. You were in despair. It was cold and wet, and the sky hidden by clouds and rain.
Well, it sounds like a typical description of a rotten summer, and a rotten summer is caused by depression after depression, Atlantic low after Atlantic low, sweeping across the Channel.
So William could not have been in control of when he sailed.
There are people who say that William was waiting until Harold had disbanded his forces. I don't think that is so.
In fact, in their close reading, the Granges have unearthed an episode missing from the Bayeux Tapestry. Shortly after William set sail, his fleet was shipwrecked. Men were drowned and had to be buried in secret.
Things went very wrong indeed. In modern terminology, he's tearing his hair out. He doesn't know what to do next.
Far from being in control, William was now stranded on the Normandy coast.
This is the middle of September, nearly the end of September, and it's getting to that time where no sensible person would put to sea in ancient law.
But then the unexpected happened. The weather changed, and William decided to take a gamble. Good luck, rather than good planning, got him across the channel. And luck was still on his side when he landed. There was no one there to oppose him. Harold had an urgent appointment up north.
Suddenly, out of absolutely nowhere, came a guy called Harold Hardrada, Europe's preeminent warrior. He loved war. He loved killing people. If you want where he is in the model, he's actually beyond even there. He hated planning. Planning was not what Harold Hardrada did.
A third contender had arrived to claim the English throne, the Viking, Harold Hardrada. As a project manager, he had quite a different style.
Nowadays, he would have been armed with a mobile phone in each hand, a pager, a PDA, driving his Mondeo up the M6 at 100 miles an hour. He probably woke up one morning and said, "Let's invade England." And everyone said, "What's the plan?" He said, "I don't care, let's just do it." Harold Hardrada, there's no doubt about it.
Stephen thinks the way Harold dealt with the Vikings shows he had the better leadership skills.
Harold had done something quite incredible. He'd inspired his men to march from London to York in 4 days. And sure enough, there was Harold Hardrada having a few beers with the lads, saying what a great army they'd wiped out up north and how they wouldn't see Harold for weeks. And suddenly, over the hill came the Southern English army. Hardrada could not believe it. You can imagine this army just coming over the hill and Hardrada just going, "Bugger." He didn't stand a chance. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was a massacre.
Stamford Bridge was an amazing victory for the Anglo-Saxons. The Vikings had arrived in 300 ships. They went back in just 24. Among those killed on the field was Hardrada himself. This surprise attack had proved that King Harold was a brilliant general, perfectly capable of seeing off invaders. But while Harold was reveling in his success, trouble was brewing down south. William had finally landed at a town called Hastings. Two weeks later, they would meet here, 7 miles inland, at a place that would forever after be known simply as Battle. So why did William choose this spot? A good general decides carefully where a battle should take place. Paul Hill believes the landscape around Battle and Hastings contains vital evidence about William's strategy. To get a sense of what the landscape was like in 1066, he has enlisted the help of a team of mapping experts. They're using the latest technology, Geographical Information Systems, or GIS, to make precise images of the area. They're able to create 3D maps, not only of the present, but also the past. Will their map of Hastings reveal the secret of William's success?
The beauty of a GIS is that you're able to bring data into one system in a way that really hasn't been easily possible before.
The first stage is to remove all traces of the present.
And what we really need to do is to peel back the layers from the modern world and get back to the landscape of 1066 and give us the opportunity of roaming around that landscape as though we were a bird flying above the scene.
To build a picture of the past, Dominic needs information from the ground itself. Beneath the surface of today's landscape is a hidden record of the last 4,000 years.
1, 2, 3.
By coring into it, Simon Jennings and Christine Smith have discovered that the coastline of Hastings was very different in 1066.
The lower part of the core down here is dominated by these solid lumps of wood, probably alder, and this represents the remains of the original woodland when this area was completely wooded. And we then get into this grey to orange mossled silty clay, and this represents an estuary. Here we have roughly the 1066 layer, and that has pollen grains typical of salt marsh, which would include Chenopodiaceae, salt marsh grasses. We also find things called hystricopheres, which are very diagnostic of tidal conditions. Up here is about the 15th century or so, and this is the roots and the remains of the present vegetation.
Today, this area near Hastings stretches for miles inland. In 1066, it was part of the sea. When this evidence is fed into the GIS, it gives a very different picture.
So that's what it's looking like at around about the time of Hastings.
Yes, and so we can see a completely different form of shoreline. So the area that we're interested in around Battle was squeezed between areas of marsh and also by very steep-sided valleys.
The map demonstrates that in 1066, the area from Hastings to Battle was a peninsula, narrowed by difficult terrain.
Other areas now, other estuaries.
This is the first surprise for Paul. Far from William calling the shots, he appears to have been trapped.
It really does constrain William's room for manoeuvre.
There's no room for manoeuvre, is there really? But he's also bottled up. He's only got one way out.
When Dominic adds a layer of road information from old maps, it makes it clear that William had only one option.
Do you think that the older ones are the ones along the ridgeways?
Almost certainly the older
Right.
ones are along the ridgeways. They would have been much drier and easier to traverse in all weathers.
Battle is at the end of a long ridgeway coming directly from Hastings. In 1066, this would have been the major road from the south coast to London.
Whoever controls that passage into the Hastings Peninsula and, of course, that passage out of the Hastings Peninsula has won the game strategically.
The map suggests that person was not William, but Harold.
The impetus is certainly with Harold, and I think he's doing what he did at Stamford Bridge as well. He's dominating the campaign with rapid movement. This whole element of surprise seems to be key in Harold's psychology.
In 1066, much of this area of medieval England was covered by a huge forest called the Weald. When this is added, the map has a final surprise.
Right. Excellent. Right, now that's quite interesting because you could have forces coming down through the Weald on these two tracks, meeting to the north of the modern town of Battle at the
Indeed
time.
so.
I mean, what it says to me is it's a good place to form up, to make a meeting point.
The addition of the forest forces Paul to think again. Although Battle was a good place for troops to meet up, no general would choose to fight without open space behind him.
After Harold's formed up, I think what he's probably intending to do is to carry on down this trackway towards Hastings. Although it looks like Harold is blocking the road to London, I think it's William blocking the road to Hastings that's happened.
The map has led to some unexpected insights. At first, Harold's tactics seem to have been the better. He responded quickly and almost managed to outmaneuver William. But at the last moment, it was William who surprised Harold, forcing him to fight at a place he would never have chosen.
Harold and William have had a sort of game of mind chess over a period of time, and William has won it. I think that he must have some intelligence that Harold is forming up on the hill there, and he must think, this is my golden chance, I have to have a quick decision. He probably thinks, I'm going to go north and I'm going to get him. When he wakes up in the morning, I'll be at the bottom of the ridge waiting for him.
And this is exactly where William and his army did position themselves, at the bottom of a hill, where the fate of England would be decided. As the sun rose on the morning of the 14th of October, the Anglo-Saxons formed up side by side in an impenetrable barrier known as a shield wall. All William could do was to throw the full weight of the Norman cavalry against it. The Battle of Hastings would last all day. It was one of the longest battles in medieval history. One reason it lasted so long is that the battlefield is a hill. Paul believes the lie of the land played a crucial part in how the day unfolded.
At the bottom of the slope here, William, he's got a big hill to climb. He's got to get right up onto that ridge and knock the soldiers off it. We know that he can't go round the back of the ridge because not only has Harold lined the top of the ridge with some of his best soldiers, but also just beyond the trees on either side of the ridge are two steep ravines, and you simply can't get round them.
But if Harold started with an advantage on the ground, it's always been said that William had the better army, because the Normans fought on horseback, and that made all the difference. Or did it? Horse trainer and rider Anne Hyland thinks that although horses were powerful, they were not without their problems. She thinks their role has been oversimplified by historians who don't understand how animals behave.
There's a tremendous difference in all the temperaments of horses, as much in horses as there are in humans. It's not just a man on a horse charging an enemy and the horse behaving like a machine. It just doesn't happen like that. The horse has got feelings, he has got a mind of his own.
So how much could the Norman horses be relied upon? Anne has looked at the Bayeux tapestry with a horsewoman's eye. She can pick out telling details that explain the horse's strength.
All knights rode stallions. We know they're stallions because they've got the full equipment in the requisite area under here. Stallions have a natural aggression, a hormonal aggression.
Part of the power of these horses was done to testosterone, but the tapestry shows they were also controlled by fierce equipment.
When war horses were trained, they normally wore a curb bit. They wouldn't have been very subtle about the use of it. And this part here, called a port, would rotate and hit the roof of the horse's mouth. So you've really got the horse in a vice. It would be used in a very, very savage manner, but it would have been able to stop a tank.
The great advantage of being on horseback was that weapons could be thrown with much more force. This was known as shock tactics and was made possible by the Norman saddle.
When you're casting a weapon, you can put a lot more poundage behind it if you can brace your thighs against the front of the saddle. The back stopped him being butted out of the saddle by a lance thrust from an enemy.
These details prove that although the Norman horses were powerful, they could also be unpredictable and needed strict control. And it was control that would be needed to break the Anglo-Saxon shield wall if the Normans were to win. Because the men who made up this wall were no pushover.
The Normans described the missiles that they received during the course of these charges as being somewhat unusual. Here's a mace in the middle of the sky here, just been thrown out of the enemy lines. There's an axe, maybe that's about to be thrown. Here are the javelins locked in place behind the shields of these two well-armed warriors here. They're about to throw them.
Behind the wall, the Anglo-Saxons were armed not only with missiles, but also with battle axes. These have been written off as primitive weapons, no match for the modern fighting style of the Normans. But Pete Seymour has spent years making and wielding battle axes, and he appreciates what can be done with them.
The best move for any axeman is a crushing blow, slash at close quarters. You could parry the butt of the weapon, which is very useful. It's a very dexterous weapon.
The axe is simple to make, but by understanding its design, Pete thinks you can appreciate its versatility.
It has a long cutting edge, quite often over 12 inches, which could make a very nasty injury, if not instant death, with very little effort. Any old bog iron could be smelted down and used for the body of the axe. This was compensated for by having an edge heat welded on of high carbon steel, which could be sharpened and would keep its edge for a long time. And if you got in a tight corner, or maybe even if the head got cut off by a sword, you had the butt end like a quarterstaff that could do terrible damage to someone's face or groin.
By the end of the morning, the Battle of Hastings had reached stalemate. Neither the axemen nor the cavalry had gained the advantage. One reason historians have given for the Norman weakness is that the performance of their horses was affected by the slope of the hill.
The hill is going to sort the stronger from the weaker animals. There are going to be disparities in their speeds.
Anne thinks the real problem was not speed, but the lack of coordination in the Norman cavalry.
To deliver the shock tactic, the animals have got to stay together. You're going to have some horses that are going to chicken out, are going to try and turn. So I doubt very much that they got to the shield wall in one nice line.
Unfortunately for Harold, the terrain stopped his men taking advantage of this Norman weakness.
This ridge is really quite a narrow one. It's only 600 or 700 yards long, and he's bringing up to 10,000 men, and they're getting more and more tightly packed on this ridge. The Bayeux Tapestry shows close order formation with shields overlapping, just as many of the historical accounts of the day had said. In fact, some of them are supposed to have died standing up. It was so constricted.
So in fact, the lie of the land affected the Anglo-Saxons more than the Normans. And those who were most constricted were Harold's crack troops, the axemen.
These were the royal bodyguard in the Anglo-Saxon ranks. Of course, they found themselves at great disadvantage, trying to wield a weapon that is primarily a slashing and whirling tool when they were cramped in the Anglo-Saxon lines. The men armed in this way could hardly have been at their most effective, shoulder to shoulder on a very steep piece of terrain.
As the fighting continued into the afternoon, both generals needed a way to break the deadlock. It seems to be William that found one. Something made the Anglo-Saxons leave their shield wall.
Most of the chronicles agree that what happened at one point in the battle is that the Saxons were teased off the ridge, apparently yelling as they went. And it's here that the central Norman command turned and wheeled on these flying Saxons.
It seems the Anglo-Saxons thought victory was in their grasp. They were wrong. The Normans cut them to pieces. Was this a clever trick by William? Accounts say that he had made his horses charge the Anglo-Saxons, but then pretend to run away, teasing them off the ridge. But were the Norman cavalry capable of such a tactic?
There's only two ways that animals can extricate themselves from a charge en masse. And one is by veering the same way, otherwise they'd be bumping into each other. Or else they could have performed the rollback. All that is a horse going fast one way, turning within its own length on its hocks and coming back the other way without losing any appreciable speed. The same manoeuvre had been used in warfare for many hundreds of years.
William's use of this tactic seems to be proof that he was a more cunning general. But the fact that it worked doesn't necessarily mean it was cleverly planned.
Horses are herd animals. They will go where the leader goes. When the Normans fled, some horses would have turned and it would have had a knock-on effect. Herd animals.
Many Anglo-Saxon lives were lost in this incident, but that was probably down to William's good luck as much as his skill. And the battle was still not over. The outcome would actually depend on a single death. There was one thing above all others that mattered on the medieval battlefield: the fate of the leader. Once the leader fell, the battle was deemed to be over. During the long battle at Hastings, William was in danger far more often than Harold. He had 3 horses killed underneath him, and at one point was thought to be dead. If he had been, the course of history would have been entirely different.
Here he's lifted his visor. This is the Duke himself. He's lifted his visor and he's pointing at his face. He's probably shouting a lot as well. And next to him is the standard bearer, and he's saying, "This is William. He's still alive. So come on, steady yourself."
The moment passed, and it was not William who would be the first to die. The evidence now suggests that the leaders and the armies were equally matched. Dusk approached, and all Harold had to do was hold on until the darkness made it impossible to continue. So what eventually did tip the balance? The final clue is staring Paul in the face.
The legend is that the high altar of the Abbey Church marks the site of the death of Harold. And that says to me that the landscape has dictated where the crucial blows finally fell.
Harold's death spot should be in the center of the ridge. That's where he would normally have fought, at the heart of his troops. But the altar of Battle Abbey is over to the right side of the ridge. This was where Harold found himself at the end of the day, fighting in his front ranks. It was the landscape that proved his downfall. The hill was not as steep on this side, and as dusk fell, the Normans found this weak spot.
It makes military sense that the final decision should have happened up there. Harold has to move over with his personal bodyguard and his standards, perhaps 200 or 300 men, because he's spotted a real calamity. Before that side of his army fell to pieces, it's hard to say who was going to win the day. He's having to shore it up, and that's where he dies.
Harold dying with an arrow in his eye is the most famous scene on the Bayeux Tapestry. And it makes military sense that this really is the spot where it happened. So the altar of Battle Abbey is the one clue on a battlefield that has never yielded archaeological evidence. But what about the arrow in Harold's eye?
I do not think that Harold was killed by an arrow to the eye. I think that is an invention of the Bayeux Tapestry.
If there's one thing everyone knows about the Battle of Hastings, it's that Harold died from an arrow in the eye. But is that really what happened? David Bernstein is one of the few people ever to have examined the Bayeux Tapestry close up. He thinks the scene of Harold's death raises an interesting question.
This has been one of the most controversial scenes because it's unclear which of the figures is actually the king, the one whose head is framed by the name Harold, or the one who is more clearly down and out, who falls under the words, "is killed." Actually, there was a convention in medieval art to show a person twice in one episode.
It's possible that both figures could be the dying Harold, especially when you take a closer look at the figure on the right.
When you look more closely at the brow of that figure, you see something very interesting. There are small holes which extend the line beyond the handle of the axe. This suggested by the spacing, the size of the holes, and the discoloration around it, that in fact there had at one time been stitchery there of an arrow.
So both characters are probably Harold. And this one is also being chopped in the thigh. This fits with the gory description of Harold's death in an account written in 1068, earlier than the tapestry itself, an account called the Carmen, or Song of the Battle of Hastings.
The first, cleaving his breast through the shield with his point, drenched the earth with a gushing torrent of blood. The second smote off his head below the protection of the helmet, and the third pierced the innards of his belly with his lance. The fourth hewed off his thigh and bore away the severed limb. The ground held the body thus destroyed.
But the Carmen is also interesting for what it doesn't say.
Nothing is said about an arrow to the eye.
If Harold was not hit in the eye, why would the Bayeux Tapestry show it? David has an explanation.
In medieval art and lore, blinding was often interpreted as a punishment by God for a particular sin. I think that the creators of the Bayeux Tapestry invented the motif of blinding as a way of showing punishment for a particular crime that Harold had committed.
The blinding of Harold should not be read as the truth of what happened at the battle. At the time of the Bayeux Tapestry, blinding was seen as a punishment by God.
I think that the Bayeux Tapestry was created as a two-act drama, and at the end of Act 1, Harold swore an oath to William that he would further William's claims to the throne of England. Then, at this scene, which shows the death of the king, the artist had the problem of showing how did that oath-breaking affect his outcome, and that blinding was a metaphor to show his punishment by God.
Whatever the weapon that killed him, Harold did die. By medieval convention, on his death, the majority of the Anglo-Saxons gave up the fight, and William took victory. Harold's closest elite troops died with him on the hill.
This was wonderful for William because the whole of the board of directors of England Incorporated was killed at Hastings. So as a hostile takeover, you get the company and actually you kill every main board director. That was William's idea of a good outcome. Finally, we have the winner, William. He's made it to be king instead of just Duke of Normandy. It's the thing that had driven this man since his childhood. He wanted to be legitimate, and now he was a legitimate king. No longer to be known as William the Bastard, he was going to be known as William the Conqueror.
William didn't win the Battle of Hastings because he was a better general. Harold and William were well matched as opponents. Both had good luck and bad. But on the day of the battle itself, victory for the Normans came down to the simple fact that Harold was killed first. William was victorious, and the future of England was changed forever.